this example, I'm going to show you how to create a new iOS app that uses Firebase in order to store data in the cloud. Firebase is an API provided by Google that allows you to store data in the cloud and retrieve it from multiple devices concurrently. Since this is a third-party API and not built into iOS, there's a few extra steps that we have to go through in order to create a project using Firebase. To start, we're going to create a project like we normally would. We'll go to Xcode, New Project. So far, we've only been using single view applications, so we're going to stick with that. I'm going to call my project FB Test, or Firebase Test. I'm going to press Next. It's important to note your organization identifier. You'll need to enter that in when you're configuring Firebase. So either take note of it now, or be prepared to go back and look it up in a few steps. Press Next. Choose a location to save the project. Okay. Now we have a blank Xcode project for a single view application. Of course, I'm going to change to run a smaller simulator so I don't overtax my system. The next thing is important. You actually have to close your project because some of the setting changes we're going to make require the project itself to be closed. Alright, that's the first step. The second step is installing the Firebase API files in your project. To do this, we're going to use a program called CocoaPods. CocoaPods is a program designed to help you manage third-party APIs. Unfortunately, with CocoaPods, there's no pretty application or no graphical user interface to interact with it. So we're going to have to go to the command line. Right. So the first step is to install CocoaPods. This quick tutorial doesn't show you how to install CocoaPods. There's another link on the website for that. If you haven't installed CocoaPods on your machine, please do so now and then get back to this video. Alright, so the next thing I need to do is open up Terminal. Terminal is the program on the Mac that gives us access to the command line. I'm going to go to the Finder by clicking on the Finder button. I'm going to close all my files. I don't need that. Go up to the Go menu, select Utilities, and near the bottom of the Utilities window there'll be something called Terminal. I'm going to launch it, and it gives me a command prompt. The command prompt is just a place where I can type the name of programs I want to run and hit return, and the program will run. Right, that's the whole idea behind a command prompt. So I'm going to do a couple things. The first thing I need to do is move into the directory that contains my Xcode project. I do that with a command named cd. That's short for change directory. So you do cd space, and then you type the directory you want to move into. In the case of Mac OS, it's actually pretty easy. We can drag our FB test. Remember when I created this, I saved it on the desktop. I can drag it and drop it here into Terminal, and it will put exactly where that particular folder is. So cd, and there's the path to the folder. I press return. Notice how the prompt changed a little bit. It now says FB test instead of tilde. That's a sign that you've changed directories. If you're curious of what directory you're in at any time, you can type pwd, stands for print working directory, hit return, and it will tell you the directory you're currently in. That's the correct directory that matches my project folder. Okay, just so that you can see that we're actually making changes to the files inside the project folder, I'm going to go ahead and open it so we can see these side by side. We have our Xcode project, the one we've used over the past few weeks, and then we have the FB test folder that contains our actual source code. Right, so the first thing we need to do for CocoaPods is to create what's called a pod file that lists all the third-party APIs we want to use. CocoaPods provides a command line command for creating an empty skeleton file, template file for us. That command is pod space init. So you type pod space init, press return. It should run for a moment and create an empty pod file. Notice that in our FB test directory, that's exactly what happened. We have something called pod file here. The next thing we need to do is edit the pod file and list the third-party APIs we want to use. So I'm going to drag my pod file, drop it onto Xcode, so I get this editor. And you can see it's just a small template. The place you want to add additional pods is right here after this comment. For this particular file, this hashtag, this pound, indicates a comment. So I'm going to put a new line right after that. There are 4 different pods that we need to import to use Firebase. The syntax is just pod space single quote and then the name of the API. In this case, we need to import Firebase. We need pod Firebase core, Firebase /core, pod Firebase /database. The database API is what we're really interested in. That's the one that's going to let us store data in the cloud. The other 2 are just needed to run the database. The 4th one is pod Firebase /auth. This is used to authenticate users within your app, either with Facebook or Google or some other form, right? That's what the auth API supports. In our case, we're just going to stick with anonymous users, but anonymous users still needs to authenticate as anonymous, so we still need this particular API. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save the changes, close the window, go back to my terminal. Now that I've created my pod file with a list of third-party APIs I want to include, the next command I need to run is pod install. This can take a few minutes, right? Oh, look at that. There's an error. Clearly I have a typo. I typed Firebase instead of Firebase. So I'm going to go back and edit my file and find my mistake. There we go. Firebase /core. Close the window. Run pod install again. And it actually goes out to the internet, finds everything you need for all these APIs, and installs them within your project. The very, very first time that you run pod install, it may actually take 2 or 3 minutes because it's downloading a lot more information. The second, third, fourth time you run it, it runs a lot faster. You only need to run pod install once every time you change your pod file. In this example, we set up a pod file once and never change it, so we don't need to run it again. That's all we need to do in the command line. So I'm going to type exit to log out of there and quit terminal. Notice there are now a couple of other files that have been created. There's a folder called pods, which is going to contain all the third-party APIs. But what I really want to draw your attention to is now we have 2 files here, an Xcode proj and an XC workplace. Right. When you're using pods and third-party APIs, you need to edit the workplace. I'm going to double-click on the workplace. And you'll notice here in a file browser, it includes 2 Xcode projects, effectively. One is the FB test project that we created initially, which is our app, and the other is an Xcode project that includes all the pods or all the third-party APIs. So this Xcode workspace file actually allows us to combine multiple projects together. This file was created automatically for us when we ran pod install, so we don't have to worry about it too much. You just have to be aware when you open your project to work on it, always open it with the XC workspace. All right, back to my project. Now that we actually have the third-party API integrated, again, I'm going to change this back to a 6S so I don't tax my computer as much. Now that we actually have the Google Firebase API integrated, we need to actually go to the Google Firebase website and set up a new project or a new database instance for this particular app. So I'm going to go over here to a web browser. The URL is firebase.google.com. I'm already logged in, but normally you just log in with your normal Google account. And this is the welcome page that you see when you first log in. You want to press the Go to Console button. When you go to the console, it'll help you. It'll allow you to add new projects. You can see I already have a couple projects here. That's fine. You can create as many as you want. So there's a button that says Create New Project. I'm going to click that. We need a name for our project. I'm going to call it FB Test to be consistent with what I named the app in Xcode, although technically you don't have to be consistent with the project name. So I press Create. It thinks for a moment while it's creating all the resources it needs on the servers, on the Google servers. All right. Now the project is actually created. It takes you to the console screen for that particular project. And notice, top of the screen, there's some Getting Started buttons. What we want to do is add Firebase to an iOS app. So we're going to click that button. Here it asks for our iOS bundle ID. This is the point where you have to enter the bundle ID that you typed in when you created the app. Maybe you wrote it down, maybe you remember it. If you don't remember it, go back to Xcode, click on the FB test Xcode project, and you'll notice it shows right here our bundle identifier under the general settings bundle identifier. I'm just going to copy that and paste it in so that I don't risk creating a typo. All right, so now our bundle ID is in. We press add app. This creates a configuration file that we need to add to our Xcode project. And there's a little animation, it quickly downloaded. It's a very small file. So I'm going to go to the downloads menu, press this little magnifying glass, and it shows me the configuration file that it downloaded from Firebase. I'm going to drop it here into my Firebase project, my FB test folder, drag and drop. Whenever you're dragging files in, always make sure this copy items if needed is checked, because otherwise it makes it hard to share your project with other people and submit it. All right, go ahead and press finish. Now we have the file that Google downloaded, and you can see there's just some basically cryptic random number looking things, but this is what the Firebase API needs to connect this app with the particular database instance we just created. Okay. The next thing we need to do, let's finish adding it to our app. We press continue. At this point, Firebase is reminding us, their quick start wizard here is reminding us to go ahead and do pod init and pod install. We've already done that step, so there's nothing additional for us to do here. And then the fourth step that it lists is add this initialization code into your app. I'm going to hold off on that for a moment. Yeah, you could either copy and paste it out of this window into your app, or I'll show you some initialization and in fact a little bit of code that you can put in to test to make sure that your app is connecting to Firebase correctly. Okay, and remember to click the Swift button since we're dealing with Swift and you probably don't care to see what the Objective-C looks like. Okay, press finish. When I first started talking about this, I said we're going to use anonymous users in this particular app. We still have to log in, but it's just anonymous, so there's no username or password. We don't have to ask the user for that information. It still requires authentication, however. By default, anonymous authentication is turned off. So I'm going to click on the Auth tab over on the left-hand side, select Sign In Method, select Anonymous. You see how it's disabled by default in a new project. Select that, select Enable, press Save, and now we're able to log in with the anonymous user to our app. After that, I'm going to go back to the database. This lists the data that we have available. Right now, there's no data. This is the name of our database instance, FB test 8050A, and null indicates there's no data, which is what you expect when you first create a database for an app. I'm going to go back to Xcode now and add in the specific code that we need for Firebase integration. So the first thing we need to do is import the Firebase API. So we're going to do import Firebase. I'm going to do import Firebase auth, like that. So we're going to import those two APIs. So we can use them here. Notice that I'm in my AppDelegate now. I am not in the storyboard, the viewcontroller.swift file. All right, so I'm going to go to this particular function here. Application did finish launching with options. This function is called early on when your app initially launches. It's only called one time, and it allows you to do any sort of final configuration or initialization that you need to do, right? One time only in your app, right? And this comment alludes to that override point for customization after application launch, right? And the way I'm going to set this up is when the application launches, I'm going to connect to the Firebird database, and I'm going to log in as the anonymous user, right? So we only need to do that once, and since we're not asking for a username or password, it makes sense to do this in this particular function. All right, so the code for doing this, the first is fir app.configure. This calls a function that loads the Google service info plist file and actually connects up to the Google servers to make sure that all the data in this file is correct. So this establishes the connection to the Google Firebase service. The second function I'm going to call is going to be is going to authenticate us as an anonymous user. That's FIR auth.auth. And some of the syntax we haven't talked about, specifically the question mark. The question mark is important. As I said, we haven't talked about it yet. We'll get to that shortly. But for the time being, just treat this as template code that you can just put into your app to sign in anonymously. And the function we finally want to call is sign in anonymously. Completion, the name of the parameter, and we're passing in nil or nothing. So with those 4 lines of code, we've now signed into our Firebase app anonymously. There's one more change that we need to make to a configuration setting in our project before we can run this. So I'm going to go back to FB test. This is where we find all the configuration settings for our project. I'm going to go to the capabilities. We need to turn on key sharing capability, otherwise a number of the Google services don't work. And we're just going to go ahead and select a team. That's my personal account. You probably only have your personal account since that's the Apple ID that you entered in Xcode when you synchronized the app to a device in lab. All right, with all that done, we can finally run our app. Right. We have a number of compiler warnings. This comes from the Firebase code itself. They're nothing that you can fix. Unfortunately, you just have to ignore them, even though that's not really what you're supposed to do with warnings. So just leave them. There's nothing we can do to resolve them. All right, so there's a couple things I'd like to point out. Here we have an empty app. That's what we expect. We didn't add anything to the storyboard, right? And we have down here in this output, we have a whole bunch of output, and the output keeps going and going and going. So much of this debug output actually makes it hard to figure out what's going on. So I'm going to stop the app. The first thing I want to do is change it so that we don't see all that debug output. To do that, we click on the FB test up here, go to Edit Scheme, select Run, select Arguments. See where it says Environment Variables. You may need to expand the triangle to see it, and you press the plus button. We're adding an environment variable with the name OS Activity Mode. It needs to be all uppercase. It's case sensitive, and the value is going to be disable. And adding that environment variable is going to make most of that output go away. I can show you an example of that by running the app again immediately. Right. And what we should see here, there's still some output, but notice how there's substantially less. Right. So there you go. So now the output's reduced. We've authenticated with an anonymous user. We've added the Firebase API to our app, but it doesn't really confirm that it's working. So what I like to do is just quickly add data into our empty database to make sure it works. In order to do that, I'm going to edit my storyboard file. I'm going to stop my app. It doesn't need to be running in the background. Edit my storyboard file. Bring out a new button. Like that. And I'm going to call this test post because we're going to post data to the database. Bring up the assistant editor. Create an action from the button to my code so that there's something, so I can run code when the user presses the button. That's what an action does. I have to make sure the connection type is an action. I call that connection test button. Press connect, and now here we have our action, our function where we can add our code to test out posting to the database. So I'm going to go back to my view controller file. There's a couple lines of code here. As the quarter, over the next week or so, we'll talk more specifically about adding data to Firebase and reading data back from Firebase. Right? But for the time being, it's safe to go ahead and just copy this code and use it to test the Firebase connection, because that's the goal after all, is just to make sure it works. It's not to actually store any data that we care about or retrieve any data, or retrieve data in any meaningful way. So the first line, we're going to declare a local variable, let ref equal for, the first thing I need to do is import the API. So I'm going to import Firebase database. It's the API I want. I'm going to say let ref equal for database dot database. Right, this gets a reference to an object that represents the Firebase database itself. And then I'm going to use that to get another reference that we can actually post data to. So ref is our reference to our database. It's a local variable that holds a reference to our database. We have to also create a reference to an item. I'm going to call that one item ref. So I'm going to say let item ref equals ref.child foo. So this is going to create a child foo within our database. Then the last line of code is going to be item ref.setValue. And then we pass whatever value we want it to save. So I'm going to set it to bar. So what we're doing is we're creating item foo in our database. We're using our database reference to create the item foo, and then we're setting the foo's value to bar. And we do this whenever the button's pressed. All right, so now that that's written, I'm going to go ahead and run the app again. It's going to take a moment to launch. This time I'm going to bring up the Firebase console, right? So we can see there's still nothing in the database. I'm going to bring that up side by side with the simulator. So here's a simulator with our app. We have the test post button. I'm going to press the test post button. It should think for a minute, and then all of a sudden the console shows us that, look, we have this key foo bar in our app. So we are able to demonstrate that successfully installing the API using CocoaPods, setting up the Firebase database instance using the Google website for Firebase, and then authenticating as an anonymous user, and then finally just a test post so it was easy to see that it was all working correctly. So that's how you do it. That's how you need to add Firebase to your project. And you need to do this for every single project. Normally you only have to do it one time at the beginning of the project, and you don't have to go back and tweak it. So once it's set up, it's sort of a one-time overhead, a one-time process. Hopefully this helps. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email or ask somebody else in class. Thanks